When secrets surface, Australia's most dramatic diplomatic move in decades. Today, we're uncovering a story that reads like a geopolitical thriller, but it's happening right here, right now, on Australian soil. Picture this, it's a quiet Tuesday afternoon in Canberra. Within 24 hours, Australian diplomats are evacuated from Iran. An ambassador is giving 7 days to leave the country, and the Prime Minister stands before the nation with revelation that will reshape our understanding on foreign interference. Most of us heard about the synagogue attack, the firebombing in Melbourne, the caravan full of explosives near Sydney. What we don't know, what nobody knew, was the invisible thread connecting this incident across continent. This isn't just another diplomatic spat between nations. This is Australia wielding power it rarely uses, making decisions that haven't been made since World War II. Imagine a nation so far removed from Middle Eastern conflicts that seems impossible to reduce tension to reach out our shores. Yet, here we are, discovering that the distant means nothing in an interconnected world where influence travels through encrypted messages and cash payments. Our guest today is Amy Remeikis, Chief Political Analyst of the Australia Institute. Was there when ASIO director stood next to the Prime Minister, a rare public appearance that signaled just how serious this moment was. The numbers paint a stark picture. 7 days to live, first explosion since World War II, a terrorist organization listing that will reverberate for years to come. This isn't just about Australia and Iran. It's about how modern warfare operates in the shadow, how social harmony becomes a battlefield, and how a middle power like Australia navigate increasingly dangerous waters. We'll explore what this means for every Australian, from those with family in Iran to a Jewish community living with high-end fears, from our intelligence agency to our policy on the world stage. Stay with us as we unpack one of the most significant national security moments in recent Australian history.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Part 8A. And please welcome the Australian Institute Chief Political Analyst, Amy Remeikis. How are you today?
I'm very well. Thanks for having me.
So, this is a big story right now. So, how significant it is that ASIO directly linked the IRGC to attack on Australian soil? What is your first reaction about this?
I think that most people were surprised because there had not been any indication from the government that any of this was on the boil. We knew that ASIO and our Australian Federal Police had been tasked with investigating if there were any links between some of the anti-Semitic attacks which had occurred in Australia, because it became very obvious very early that these were not just, I suppose, lone wolf attacks, that there did seem to be something deeper to it. There had been suggestions that organised crime may have been linked to it, so the security agencies were asked by the government to investigate it. And then we discovered today that Iran has been directly linked to these accounts, these attacks. ASIO is alleging that there were direct links from Iran, who had been asking people in Australia to carry out some of these attacks. It's believed to be for money. And they were so sure of those links that they told the government yesterday. The government acted very quickly in withdrawing Australia's diplomats from Iran and evacuating them to third countries. countries. Then they announced to the Iranian ambassador in Australia today, just around midday, that they were being excommunicated from Australia, that they no longer had diplomatic status, they were no longer welcome, and given 7 days to leave the country. And then about half an hour after that happened, the Prime Minister was fronting the press with the ASIO director, our Home Affairs Minister, and our Foreign Affairs Minister to announce all that had just occurred in the last 24 hours.
Could this explosion escalate tension between Canberra and Tehran? Because what Prime Minister said, they're gonna expose the ambassador. This is the first time after World War II.
It is, it is almost unheard of for Australia to take this step. In fact, Australia still has diplomatic relationships with Israel, and the Israeli ambassador is still in Australia, despite some very strong words from Israel about what Australia was doing in regards to preventing anti-Semitism, some attacks from Israel Prime Minister against our Prime Minister, and indeed the IOF's killing of an Australian aid worker in Gaza. So it's quite unusual for Australia to actually take the step of expelling diplomatic, ambassadors to Australia. The Russian ambassador chose to leave. I believe it wasn't an expulsion. So Australia has had relations with Israel, I think, since the 1970s. And so while there is some concern, this may actually help to further strain the relations between Australia and Iran. They were already pretty strained, to be honest. Australia did support Israel's attacks on Iran. While they didn't outwardly say that they believed them to be legal, they did say that Israel had a right to defend itself, which Iran was not happy given the international law around that. And there have been several diplomatic statements, I suppose, going back and forth over how Iran has treated women in its own country, which have raised diplomatic tensions previously. This move, though, has raised concerns that there may be a further straining of relations. ASIO has said that it is being tasked with keeping an eye to make sure that there is no retaliation, but it is a very bold move from the Albanese government.
So, Amy, how rare it is for a foreign state to carry out or direct attack inside Australia?
It is rare. It's rare for us to hear about it. I suppose that's probably the fairest. I mean, we constantly hear that there's been attempts at cyber attacks. There's been allegations that China has attempted to meddle in Australia's affairs previously, and that Russia has perhaps tried to meddle in Australia's affairs. But it's quite rare to hear that a foreign nation has actually taken the step of allegedly paying people, actors in Australia, to carry out physical attacks. Now, the firebombing in the Melbourne synagogue did not have any injuries, but it did create quite a lot of fear in the Jewish community, and it did help to inflame tensions that already exist in Australia over the Australian government's position on the Gaza war. There was another thwarted attack where there was a caravan full of explosives just outside Sydney, which also led to inflamed tensions and concerns for the Jewish community. So it is quite rare for us to hear that another nation has carried out, attempts at social disharmony and attacks. And I mean, really, that makes sense. Australia is so far on the other side of the world. We are a middle player internationally. We're not heavily involved in diplomatic affairs outside of the Pacific. So it's quite strange to think that another nation may want to meddle in Australia's social harmony, as ASIO is alleging that Iran has.
So, from a security perspective, Amy, how serious is the decision to expel an ambassador?
It's very serious. It's not something that Australia takes lightly at all, and it remains to be seen whether these relations can ever be repaired. Because it's not just expelling of the Iranian ambassador. Australia is now going to make the Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps a terrorist organisation in Australia, and that is something that has been called for by our conservative opposition for some years. Australia's Labor government had resisted those calls, but this afternoon announced that they would be starting the process to have them listed as a terrorist organisation. That is going to have diplomatic ramifications. That is going to strain Australia's relationship with Iran and its allies. But whether or not it actually has any tangible impact, I don't think that it will, mostly because Australia is protected by its geography. Australia is a minor player in these sorts of affairs. And for the most part, Australia's population want to see the Albanese government take a stronger stand against Israel in what it's doing to the Palestinians in Gaza. There have been marches of up to 300,000 people as recently as the weekend calling for more sanctions on Israel or sanctions on Israel and an end to Australia sending the weapons parts which end up in weapons and F-35s that Israel is using. And so the reaction to this announcement about the Iranian intervention in Australian affairs hasn't been as cut and dried, I think, as the government would have expected. There's a lot of people saying, okay, great, it's good that the security agencies have been able to be on top of that, but what are you doing in regards to the Israeli ambassador, given we know what Israel is doing in Gaza? Our government is going to recognize Palestine at the next UN General Assembly meeting in a couple of weeks, and it has been documented that Israel is carrying out war crimes in Gaza, which go in contravention to conventions the Australian government has signed our country up to.
So, what risks do Australian in Iran face following the government's announcement?
There has been a travel advisory against going to Iran for some years from Australian authorities, and there have been calls since pretty much October 7, 2023 for Australians in the region, including in Iran, to leave. There were many Australians who chose to leave after Israel fired missiles on Iran, and the ones who are or who remain in Iran who have Australian citizenship, there's been an acknowledgement that it's exceptionally hard for Australia to provide any diplomatic assistance. So the government, without saying it, is essentially saying we have been advising people to leave or to not travel to Iran for some years. Now, of course, it's quite complicated for people who have family in Iran or who want to go visit Iran and visit their families, or who have Australian citizenship but have decided to make their home back in Iran. That is quite complicated. But Australia has had a kind of hands-off approach to that pretty much since the escalation of Israel's attacks in the regions after October 7. And while there would still be diplomatic assistance provided, I think it would be quite difficult. In terms of the personal security of Australians in the region, the government has been asked about that, and they said that they don't believe that there would be any retribution carried out against Iranian Australians, given the close ties Iranian Australians have to Iran and their communities there.
So, how vulnerable now the Australian Jewish community to future attacks since this prime minister announced this recently?
It's been one of the issues that Australia has been grappling with since October 7. There has been a lot of talk about whether the Australian government has been doing enough to quell anti-Semitism within Australia, and these attacks really did sort of, amplify concerns. The state governments in Australia also used those attacks to pass some very strong laws, which sometimes conflated anti-Semitism with criticism of Israel, as well as cracking down on protest, which has not necessarily done anything to make Australia's Jewish community safer, as there has become a real, I suppose, dividing line between those who want to see Israel held to account for its actions in Gaza, as opposed to those who are really worried about, very real anti-Semitism in Australia. Both things can be true. The Jewish community have said that they are pleased to see that ASIO and security agencies have been taking these attacks so seriously and that they have been doing these investigations. But Benjamin Netanyahu himself said in December, after a fire in one of the Australian synagogues, that this was a direct result of Australia not doing enough to tamper down on anti-Semitism. And it turns out that one of those attacks actually is one of the ones that they're linking to Iran. We've had an anti-Semitism envoy who was just reported to the government calling for a stronger definition of anti-Semitism to be applied, which would be criticism of Israel being considered anti-Semitic. That envoy also used some of those attacks as proof that, there was unchecked hate going on in Australia. And it turns out that those attacks may have very well been ordered by a foreign nation, which our security agencies have picked up on. So it's a very delicate area where anti-Semitism is increasing in Australia, along with anti-Islamophobia, or people being Islamophobic, but not all of the criticism which has been leveled against Israel has been anti-Semitic. So I would say that tensions remain high. Most people in the community, though, can draw a line between what Israel is doing in Gaza and the fact that Jewish people are not responsible for that, as well as the fact that senior government ministers, even with this announcement today, have made it very clear that Iranian Australians are no more responsible for the actions of the Iranian government as Jewish people in Australia are responsible for the actions of the Israeli government.
So, Amy, how effective will listing the IRGC as a terrorist organization be in disrupting its operation?
Yeah, that's an interesting one too. It does give Australia's security powers a lot more power and agency in arresting people who they believe may have been involved in anything that the Iranian authorities are trying to do in Australia. And that is the main point of listing an organisation under the Terrorist Act, in that it does enable just the arrest for being linked to them, for being, seen to be a part of it or to be advocating for them in Australia. So it does have some power for security agencies, but I would say that things will probably go a bit quiet on that front in Australia, given how overt the Australian government has been in announcing this, because it is, as we've discussed, a really big deal to be expelling an ambassador from Australia, as well as saying that your espionage arm of your armed forces is now considered a terrorist organisation in Australia. This is not something that is going to be solved over even the next couple of years. This will be something that Australia is going to have to work through with future Iranian governments to see whether there actually is any sort of threading together of that relationship.
Sorry, my last question, Amy, is in your view, how will this reshape Australia's national security strategy going forward?
It's an interesting one because we don't actually ever hear a lot of what our national security agencies are up to. Australia is quite a secretive state, as opposed to America or even Canada, who are some of the Five Eye partners that Australia has. And so it's really hard to tell what our security agencies are up to, which is another reason why today's announcement was so unusual. It's very unusual to have the director of ASIO standing up next to the Prime Minister saying, this is what we have found, here is our concrete reasons for doing this. It is going to, I think, make things a little bit more difficult within the security community more generally, because Australia does rely on Israel's intelligence, not necessarily as part of Five Eyes, but as part of other security arrangements that Australia has. And if Australia does start pushing back against what Israel is doing in Gaza, that could potentially put some of that relationship at risk, because if Australia does expel the Israeli ambassador, or Israel gets even more annoyed at the stance that Australia is taking in recognizing Palestine and pushing back against Israeli claims of mishaps in double tapping a hospital, for instance, there is the risk that they cut off that security line, which Australia's security agencies do rely on. So it's not so necessarily the Iranian decision that's going to prove troublesome for Australia's intelligence and security communities. It's going to be what happens with Israeli intelligence if Australia takes the steps that its people want it to.
Thank you so much, Ms. Amy Remeikis, the Chief Political Analyst of the Australian Institute. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
That's it. Thank you so much. This is
Thank
another
you.
episode of Part 8A. This is Miko Santos. Thank you.
Okay.